Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And on behalf of our entire board and staff, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us for a conversation about corals. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Could you please double check to make sure that you're muted and you remain muted throughout the duration of our conversation today? The exception is during the question and answer portion at the end. There'll be two different options for you to ask questions. The first is to use the raise your hand feature, at which point I'll ask you to unmute and you can speak directly to our presenters. Or if you'd prefer, you can drop your question in the chat and I'll ask it for you at the end. That feature is super helpful if you have a question pop up during a presentation and you want to make sure you don't forget it. Well, I'm very excited to be able to introduce two of my favorite people to work with. We have Beth Firchau, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, Florida Reef Tract Rescue Project Coordinator. Beth, that is a tongue twister that I'm constantly practicing. And Jim Kinsler, SeaWorld Orlando's Aquarium Manager. Beth, I'm going to shoot it over to you.
Now the technical challenge to unmute and share screen. All right, let's go here. Let's try it. All right, so we'll get started. I think what I'll do though, so that it's a little bit easier on my video bandwidth, I think I'll go dark on my video, if that's okay, Michelle. And we'll go from there.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can all hear me fine, thanks. As Michelle said, I am Beth Firchau. I am the proud coordinator of a massive effort that we're going to share with you today. And I'd like to just start with just kind of doing a context exercise here. As you may be aware, over the last 8 years, Florida's coral reef has been in a fight for its life. Probably heard about it. And over the last 3 years, an epic historical response has taken place to ensure that while Florida's coral reef may be down, it's certainly not out. Today, we'll revisit that fight and response and share with you what we hope to do moving forward. At our last lunch presentation, and Michelle and I were kind of laughing about this month to the year, we introduced you to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums partnership with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, NOAA Fisheries, and others. As part of a massive disease response effort, the state of Florida invited AZA Zoos and Aquariums to collaborate to find homes for thousands of corals from the reef as part of a response effort to stony coral tissue loss disease. At that time, at our first presentation, our opening slide celebrated the first opening days of a great campaign to bring hope to Florida's coral reef. But today, we're starting out a bit different. But before we get started with what the future holds, I'd like to refresh our memory of how it all started. And our story is simple. It's a conservation story of hope, set against a backdrop of an ecosystem fighting for its very life. Our story is about that fight to save the largest coral reef in the continental United States. In our original presentation, we shared that a terrible, aggressive disease, stony coral tissue loss disease, was ravaging the reef like a wildfire, sweeping from the upper reaches of the reef north of Miami, all the way down to the dry Tortugas. To put in perspective what that sweep looks like, historically, disease presents in about 2 to 3% of Florida reef tract coral populations at any given time. With stony coral tissue loss disease, over 60% of the coral population is now presenting with disease. Today, stony coral tissue loss disease has swept the entire reef tract, decimating over half the reef-building coral species found on the reef, those species that are absolutely critical to the foundations of that ecosystem. In response, the state of Florida created a plan where corals with stony coral tissue loss disease would be treated in place on the reef with experimental treatments to save them from dying. At the same time, Scientists would explore what stony coral tissue loss disease was and how the disease process works in susceptible coral species. And still at the same time, thousands of smaller but sexually mature corals would be removed from the reef for safekeeping ahead of the disease progression, and they would be kept for future propagation efforts towards restoring the reef. As I mentioned earlier, AZA zoos and aquariums were invited to be the safe havens for these corals, and as a result, AZA created the Florida Reef Tract Rescue Project in 2018. Now let's stop just a little bit and just kind of explain what AZA is. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of zoos and aquariums. The AZA and its international 238 member facilities and 15 certified facilities envision a world where, as a result of their work, all people respect, value, and conserve wildlife and wild places. Each year, member institutions collectively draw more than 195 million visitors. Member institutions meet the highest standards in animal care and provide a fun, safe, and educational family experience. In addition, member institutions dedicate millions of dollars to support scientific research, conservation, and education programs. Keep in mind that less than 10% of all USDA permitted zoological facilities in the US are accredited as AZA facilities. These facilities and the folks that work at them are the cream of the crop. So the AZA and its members, at the invitation of the state, got to work. And within months of the invitation, corals were going to facilities across the country. Today, we have a network of 21 facilities managed by 22 partners in 14 states. The network is led in part by four well-known Florida conservation leaders: the Florida Aquarium, Disney, Moat, and SeaWorld. And I get the lucky duty, as I said, to be the coordinator of that project. I keep our stakeholders connected, committed, and moving forward. The largest collection of rescue corals is being managed in Orlando, Florida at the Florida Coral Rescue Center through the partnership of Disney and SeaWorld, and with the support of the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida and AZA. Jim will speak a little bit more about the center in just a minute, but suffice to say, the FCRC and these other facilities that you see on this map are setting the foundation for restoring Florida's coral reef following decimation by stony coral tissue loss disease. And just this past November, we marked our 3rd year of rescue in partnership with the state of Florida for the sake of corals. Over the past 3 years, we've built a strong response network of coral care facilities, advanced coral conservation, developed a better understanding of coral biology, and have reached out to support other countries with reefs in the same peril as our own home reef. Today, I'd like to use the FCRC as a local example to provide you with a glimpse of where we're going from here. Currently, if you look at rescue as a whole, 80% of all rescue corals in human care are being cared for at AZA facilities. And the FCRC, as I mentioned, is currently managing the largest collection of those corals. And you can see on the pie chart in the lower left, you can see the FCRC wedge there is pretty significant. So what about the future? As we begin our next 3 years, we are evolving our mission and adjusting our focus to include the long-term care of the rescue corals we already have in our collections. But we're also working towards the planned spawning or planned sexual reproduction of our broodstock for eventual outplanting of the offspring back to the reef. But to breed corals is much easier said than done. If you can believe it, much of what we understand about corals and their reproduction and offspring growth has been captured in snapshots of experiences by researchers, with incidental observations of coral spawning and offspring growth on the reef, in the ocean. Only recently have we been able to capture the land-based aquarium systems, the reproductive and larvae settlement activities that result in adult corals. Much of what we know about the reproductive strategies of these corals is still unknown. Facilities like the Florida Aquarium are spearheading the advancement of this knowledge with each spawning cycle and sharing it with facilities like the FCRC to build a foundation for what we plan for the future. We have cracked the nut on several species of rescue corals, but fine-tuning the knowledge and reproductive process to make possible mass production of these species is still needed. And it's going to need a lot of work because we're expecting to outplant hundreds of thousands, if not millions of corals to make restoration possible. So we're creating collaborative plans to provide efficient, productive, and sustainable efforts, and working group networks to support those efforts are getting formed. That planning and those working groups are operating on a national basis within the Florida Reef Tract Rescue Project, and the FCRC is part of those conversations. Two examples of how facilities like the FCRC are influencing the restoration plans for Florida's coral reef are provided here on this slide. At the request of the rescue and propagation team for the state, the project convened the Coral Holding and Propagation Working Group, or CHOP Working Group, which included the FCRC's Justin Zimmerman from SeaWorld and Kevin Curley from Disney, to draft recommendations to the state that would provide a framework from which they could draft a process to vet facilities and agencies interested in future Florida coral propagation activities. Also, at the request of the same team, members of the CHOP working group will support the team in developing reproductive protocols and larval settlement and grow out guidelines to ensure that reproductive activities are conducted with coral health and welfare in mind, and with optimizing long-term restoration success as our goal. These efforts are influencing the state's blueprints for managing coral propagation and restoration practitioners for decades to come. And as we look to the future, we also have to determine how each facility will participate in future activities. To this end, the AZA Restoration Pathway Working Group, that includes members of the CHOP Working Group as well as other strategic partners, will develop a vision and structure for executing that vision based on the guidance and mentorship of the state. In the eyes of the state, the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida and the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the FCRC is expected to play a major and significant role in future reproductive and offspring care activities. Together, we will make the vision of Florida's coral reef restoration a reality. So, as you can see, we are still working from the coral playbook because we know when we work together, we can make a huge impact. Before I toss it over to Jim Kinsler to talk more about how FCRC is envisioning its role in the future, let me just provide an invitation to connect with the project. Scanning the QR code in the upper right-hand corner will take you to the project's webpage on the AZA website. I encourage everyone to learn more about the project. I also have provided my email address to make it easy for you to connect with me if you have questions about anything you hear today. And lastly, I want to thank the foundation for providing this platform to reach all of you today, and for the foundation's relentless support of the project and restoration of Florida's coral reef. In so many ways, we would not be here if not for partners like the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll toss it to Jim.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Beth, for the handoff. Yeah, my name is Jim Kinsler, Aquarium Curator at SeaWorld, and I also have the great fortune to be the facility manager for the Coral Rescue Center, which has been just an incredible experience for myself and the coral biologists that work at the center, as well as Justin Zimmerman, our supervisor, who we couldn't do this without with his expertise. Just a quick note on this slide, all the partners that are involved with the facility in a direct relationship or maybe a supportive relationship. We couldn't do it without these folks as well. So just real quick, a kind of a recap a little bit about the facility itself. The Florida Coral Rescue Center resides in Orlando, Florida. This facility is about 2,000 square feet. We had the great fortune of having a business colleague of ours, Worldwide Corals, happened to be selling this coral farm to move in the hopes that they were moving into a larger facility. So when we were looking for equipment to build our own coral farm, our friends at Worldwide Coral said that they actually had this entire facility available. They would be willing to sell the equipment as is, and we could take over the lease and utilities, all that good stuff. So we were in the great position to have several partners involved, including Disney, the foundation, and AZA. And we were able to come up with a plan to be able to take over this facility. The Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida was kind enough to purchase all the equipment that you see there, as well as take over the lease and the utilities, and be our most direct business partner with the operation of the facility. Disney has provided the OpEx and coral expertise all along. And AZA, of course, through Beth, has been our guiding light throughout this entire endeavor. So with regards to the facility, we received our first corals in March of 2020. So we've got about 2.5 years under our belt with these corals. Currently, we have 700 colonies, and that is expanding, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the key to keeping corals is stability. And so what you see here is we have a completely climate controlled, light controlled, water parameter controlled operation. And corals are extremely sensitive. Any of those parameters, whether it's chemistry, lighting, temperature, any of those things change, it's going to throw the corals out of balance, and you can have a very negative outcome. And so that's why this is so important to maintain such a stable environment for these corals. So our progress to date, we do have the corals growing rapidly. They're stable, they're doing well. In fact, they've started spawning. And part of that is due to maintaining the proper lighting schedule. We mirror the Key West lighting schedule throughout the year. This also includes the lunar cycle. So we actually have lunar lights inside the building that simulate new moon to full moon and everything in between. So what we've seen as a result of that, particularly this year, 2022, in the spring and in the fall, in fact, we had spawning last night, we've seen 8 of our 18 species spawn to this point, which has been really exciting for us. And again, that's a testament to having all the right parameters, the stability that the corals need, and providing the detailed care that the coral biologists offer on a day-to-day basis. So what I wanted to do is showcase some of these fantastic results that we're seeing, and then talk a little bit about the future and where we need to go with this, specifically with the Florida Coral Rescue Center program. So I'm going to run through a few of the corals. This is our groove brain coral, very nice looking coral. And again, Beth, I believe, mentioned in her presentation, all of these corals are critical to the success of the Florida Reef Tract, not only because they provide habitat, they provide, stability to the reef environment or to the ocean environment itself, but these are reef building corals. They're very robust, very stout corals that provide the basic structure for the reef itself. And without them, the structure itself is going to fail and will not provide that protection, not only to roughly 25% of the ocean species, but also to our coastline. So it provides this invaluable role in the environment. So looking at the groove brain coral here, we're going to take a quick look. This is a video of this coral actually releasing some of its gametes here. Kind of a slow process, but those are some packets that it's slowly releasing, and those packets will eventually rise to the surface. That's a typical process for a lot of these corals, where they produce a packet that floats to the surface and then dissolves within a few minutes and releases the individual eggs and sperm that are carried away into the current. So this is another species we have. when we talk about these species, we always use a four-letter kind of acronym. So in this case, Musa angulosa, the spiny flower coral, we would call that the MANG. It's the first letter of the genus name and the first three letters of the species name. So MAG. So if you hear us describe it that way, that's where we're getting it from. So this is one of my favorite corals. It's got very large polyps, a lot of tissue. They're just very beautiful looking, and they come in a variety of colors, and you can see some of the data there with regards to the colonies we have at the FCRC. And this again was another species that's been spawning. And here's a really cool video. You can see the individual polyps of this coral are completely swollen up, which means they're very hydrated. They're ready, they're loaded up with gametes, and they're about to release those gametes into the water. All of this spawning happens overnight. We have our teams here from about 8 p.m. till midnight or 1 in the morning, and they're watching this activity and then collecting, the gametes after they've been spawned, and they, hopefully went through fertilization and so on. So let's take another look here. Really cool video, almost like a chain reaction with 3 different polyps firing off like that. And again, that's a mixture of eggs and sperm in that case, not necessarily individual packets. Each coral has maybe a slightly different strategy with regards to producing offspring. Everything that you see here today, these are spawners. So they release their gametes into the environment. We also have several species that are called brooders, where they have fertilization within the polyp, and then they produce the fertilized and developing larvae into the water column after the fact. This is a look at the MANG's larvae as they're just swimming around. This is a settling tank that we put together. All the little white dots that you see in there are the actual larvae, and they're starting to settle out onto the tiles. Once they settle out onto the tiles, we'll move them into another location, and then they start to develop into small coral recruits or corallites. And so that's a very exciting process for us. Now, this is one of my personal favorites. This is Mycetophilia ferox, the rough cactus coral, probably one of the most beautiful corals we have at the facility. What's really interesting about this coral is it spawned for us in March, and it looks like it went through June as well. This is the first time this species has spawned in human care that we are aware of. All of our colleagues within the program actually reached out to different outlets to confirm this, but so far as we can tell, this was the first time this species has spawned in human care. And in fact, we still have offspring from that spawn in the spring of this year, and we'll take a look at a couple of pictures here. So here are the little guys that we currently have. The picture in the bottom in the middle, that's one of the larvae. That's what the larvae look like when they're mobile. They're able to move around, swim around. Eventually they will settle, and they will develop into the pictures you see on the top left and top right. These are the coral recruits. They've already started developing pigment. They've already recruited their critical symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae. That's what will live in the tissues of the coral. It'll photosynthesize, and it'll produce nutrients for the coral to give it energy to grow. So as you see here, these 3 recruits are doing great. They have great color, great pigmentation. And currently we have 20 of those small recruits growing in locations at the FCRC. So we're very, very excited about the rough cactus coral. So here we have a couple more species that we've seen spawning. Again, fall is a very big time of year for the Florida Reef Tract and its corals. This is when the majority of the spawning will occur, is in September, August, September. So these are 2 of the species that we've collected larvae from, and we're seeing mixed results. I'll get into the future of this and explain this in a little more detail, but that's going to be the next big step for the operation. Here's a couple more species. Again, beautiful corals. Everything is kind of a variation on the theme. If you see the spots on these coral colonies, those dots or circles that you see, those are individual polyps. Each polyp has its own mouth for feeding. So you can see there's hundreds, we've got hundreds of polyps living on this colony. So each polyp will produce either eggs and sperm or a packet or something like that. Now this next video, which is Orbicella faviolata, the mountainous brain coral. This is a wicked cool video of this coral releasing its packets the other night. This literally just happened 2 nights ago. So we'll take a quick look at that. This is awesome. So you can see that the packets, and again, this is the egg and sperm all together in packets. It's rising to the surface. What it'll do is it'll hit the surface and then slowly start to dissolve, releasing the individual eggs and sperm, and they will cross-fertilize with other eggs and sperm from other colonies. They do not self-fertilize with, its own genetics, but rather it'll only fertilize with other colonies. So really cool video, awesome coral. We were able to collect a lot of larvae from that spawn as well. So just describing a little bit about, where we want to go with this. So as you can see, just looking at this picture, this facility is full, right? We've got 18 tubs in this facility. We've got 700 pieces of coral. We are built out and as full as we can be with regards to this operation. And that was the first phase of the project. It was important to get the corals in here, get them safe, get them stable. We've done that. Now it's time to move to the next phase, which is spawning and then settling and growing out the coral. So we've demonstrated that we can do the spawning part, at least to some degree. The future, as our colleagues at the Florida Aquarium have already demonstrated, is to do some focus spawning, to be able to spawn specific colonies with each other to get the genetics that we want to be able to outplant back to the reef. And there's a lot of work being done about resistance and some different things like that. So there will be, selective spawning down the road, and a lot of work that's going to go into that. So what we need to do with regards to the FCRC right off the bat is we're coming to the end of our first 3 years. We have a memorandum of understanding with all of our partners that govern this facility. And our next step is to get a new MOU written and in place for the next 3 years. Now, our partners, of course, because everybody's always on board with moving this project forward, we've already have verbal confirmation from everybody. So the next step is just to get the paperwork done. No big deal. That'll happen in the next couple of months. The big part of the project that we need to look at is, since we've demonstrated that spawning is a viable part of this project, or a viable part of the FCRC operation, is we need to be able to collect the larvae. We need to be able to settle the larvae and then grow out, these corals so that they can ultimately be outplanted. The only way to do that is to get more real estate. We need to look at another facility. We need to be able to look at, larger scale settlement and grow out, aside from the small aquariums that we're trying to use right now, just to do what we can. So that's what we're looking at, is another facility to be able to carry that next phase of the program forward, because obviously that's, we need to see this thing go full circle. So we want to see the settlement grow out in corals and ultimately return to the reef. And then we can tell the complete story about not only the entire program, but just the work that we're doing at the FCRC. So with that, I would like to say, a big thank you to all of our partners, everybody we mentioned, Disney, AZA, NOAA, FWC, and of course the foundation. The work that the foundation does with regards to being our direct business partner, to take care of all the bills, to make sure that the lights stay on, to do all of our purchasing for us. Will and Aaron, Michelle, and Andy have been fantastic for the last 3 years, and they make it easy because it allows our coral biologists to just focus on the corals. That's what they do day in and day out. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of work just caring for the corals and knowing that the facility is being taken care of And, you know, there's nothing for us to worry about, and we get everything we need when we need it. Has made this a real dream operation. And thank goodness for that, because there's a lot on the line, and we couldn't do it without our partners. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Jim. We're honored to be a partner along with AZA and Disney and SeaWorld. We've had some great questions coming in the chat, so I want to see if you and Beth are ready to tackle some of these.
Absolutely.
So great. So Beth answered one in the chat, but I thought it was just an interesting question about the different genetic variety in the tanks, Jim. And this came up, we were over at the center Monday. And one of the points Jim made to the group we were with Monday, I thought that might be interesting, Jim, for you to share about how some of these corals might not interact out on the reef, and how like that's creating some interesting potential resiliency in the tanks. If you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Well, that's definitely something that folks with, you know, on the research side of this operation, not only the FWC coral biologists, but other university folks are looking at. There's different pockets, and Beth, you might chime in on this as well. There's some pockets out there on the reef that have demonstrated what appears to be some level of resistance. There's some locations where the disease doesn't have necessarily a presence. These might be small locations, but it's enough that it's drawn the attention of folks in the field to see if there's some genetic component or level of resistance there that could be incorporated, especially on the breeding side of this operation, to be able to utilize those genetics into developing resistant corals. And so that's something that's definitely being heavily investigated and of great interest to everybody involved. And not just from a resistance standpoint, but, you know, we're also looking at, you know, we have multiple genotypes with all of these corals that we have in our care. And so there's a lot of probably focus spawning that's going to be a result of all this, to be able to make sure we're putting our best foot forward with genetic diversity and that component of disease resistance.
And I'll just add, Jim, if I can, the state and the partners, you know, that developed the disease response plan were truly visionary. They realized that the time was too short and there was too much to do to go in a linear path to respond to this issue. So they have a multi-pronged approach. And just like I mentioned in my talk, a lot of people were doing a lot of things at a lot of different ends of the project. And one of those parts of the project is reconnaissance. And so, as Jim said, there are some spots where there seems to be populations that have not been affected by the disease. But even as interesting is that in recon dives behind the disease progression now throughout the reef, they're finding that while it appeared that the disease just ravaged the reef, there were some survivors, and tiny corals, bigger corals, and the state's very interested in looking at those guys to find out what's going on. And as Jim said, there may be some projects in the future where we're taking the corals that we've rescued and sort of share the genes, so to speak, and see what we can do with making a next generation that may be a little more resilient to this disease. But certainly we have to find out where this syndrome, where this disease came from to begin with, so that we don't have to keep repeating ourselves.
Thank you both. That's incredibly well said. Barbara, to answer your question really quickly, Moat Marine is definitely a partner in the larger coral work. They're just not a partner with the Florida Coral Rescue Center itself. So I know Beth does a lot of work with Moat as part of the larger project. So that's an easy question to answer. Yeah. So Brian has a great question that I'm going to throw to y'all. During the Pliocene, when Earth's temperature was much warmer, what was the geographic range of corals?
Jim, you want to take that? You want me to?
Go ahead, Beth. That's not one of my specialties.
So I'm not a geologist. but I took enough geological oceanography to be dangerous. And yes, you're right. The Pliocene was a warmer ocean environment, and it exactly how the range has changed, I can't share, but I do know that at the height of the Pliocene, diversity definitely was much greater than it is now. In fact, the Caribbean had much greater diversity in their species than they do now. And it's a really interesting time to look at. So I kind of I've kind of half answered your question. I encourage you to look it up and see what you can explore on your own. Sorry about that.
Great. I'm not seeing anybody else with a question yet in the chat. Beth or Jim, I didn't know if anything came up listening to each other's presentations that you might have a question for each other. Jim, I love those videos. They're incredible, and it's just really special to be able to see.
I think I'd like to sort of echo Michelle's thoughts. Again, since the 1970s, the state of Florida has been very careful with their coral populations off the coast, as far as collecting them and removing them from the reef for research or even environmental education projects. And the corals that we have in our care now have been specifically approved to be collected from the reef and kept at our facilities for this response effort. And so a lot of what we've been learning about these corals is kind of on an exponential line. And it's really interesting to sit in on Thursdays. We have a holders call every Thursday. It's an hour call where all of our coral holders, whether they're AZA facilities or non-AZA facilities, get together and they just talk rescue corals. And we have researchers on from the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, FWC, NOAA Fisheries. And it's really interesting to have our aquarists and our biologists who intimately know these corals, because they see them from, sunrise to sunset every day. They see them on good days, bad days. It's really interesting to see that cross-pollination of folks who have worked out on the reef their entire career and have only seen these corals in snapshots, very short times. And to be comparing notes with our aquarists who see them all the time. And the wealth of knowledge and shared experience is phenomenal. And if I'm always kind of the person that sort of tries to find something positive in every situation you're in. And while the stony coral tissue loss disease issue is devastating and it's very heartbreaking, this response has spurred on a greater growth of our knowledge about our backyard reef than we've ever had, and about the corals. And it has brought groups together that either had worked in silos before or had never even entertained the thought of working on coral biology. And I think if you should always look for something positive, especially in conservation. And I think that's one of the greatest rewards is being able to say, hey, I did something. And my kids can ask me what I did, and this is what I did. At least I did something. And we promoted our better understanding of our oceans right off our shores.
Well said, Beth. Jim, I was thinking to Beth's point about the work that the individuals are doing. Maybe you'd like to just talk a little bit about the team over at the center and what it looks like to keep 700 corals happy enough to be making their own little babies.
Certainly, it's a very intensive process. So we have 4 biologists over at the center, as well as Justin, the supervisor, and it starts, we start at 6 in the morning, and right off the bat, a couple of times a week, what they do before the lights come up is feed the corals. Corals have a nighttime feeding response where the individual polyps will reach out with their tentacles for food. They just kind of wait for food items to drift across their tentacles, grab them, and they eat them. So the guys actively feed the corals a couple of times a week, which is a really interesting process because they're wearing little headlamps on their heads because the entire building is dark except for the lunar lights. And so they run tub to tub and broadcast feed and kind of selectively broadcast feed food into the corals. And that's the start of the day. But the remainder of the day is running chemical tests. It's cleaning the tiles. It's cleaning around the corals. It's doing all kinds of work to ensure that that stability is maintained for each of these life support systems and the overall environment for the corals. So it's a lot of work, it's a lot of maintenance, and it's every day. And one of the key things that we have to do, because corals, if a coral is unhappy, it'll let you know, but you have to be very observant and you have to know the individual colony. And if you see the colony every day and you do good observations, it'll let you know if it's unhappy. And we've had a few unhappy corals. That does happen. And they might turn a little pale. They might have a little thing on just the edge of the colony that doesn't look right. And the guys are really, really good about responding to that. We have Dr. Claire Erlacher-Reed, who's one of our veterinarians at SeaWorld. She comes out once a week. We consult with her. Anytime we have unhappy corals, we get her involved and we work on a treatment plan. But thus far, we've done pretty well at the FCRC. Only a few anomalies, and we've been able to work through all those challenges.
And I think one thing that's struck me, and both of you have talked about this, is that you're creating and advancing coral science like every day, just by the fact that you're working with corals that haven't been in human care, and just the ingenuity of the work that you're doing and being able to share with other coral colleagues. I was struck by, I think I was there a few months ago, and I saw a bunch of like take-home plastic food containers, and I was like, wow, people are really serious about their lunches over at the Coral Center. And then Monday I realized, Jim, maybe you could mention why those are used as part of the reproduction work.
Yeah, the plastic containers we were using for as we collected the larvae, and part of that was while they were still a lot of the packets were still contained, like the eggs and sperm were still in the packets. So we were collecting those and keeping those in the containers as the packets dissolve and the gametes mix and fertilize and everything. And then, as they transition into larvae, we move them into a larger tank with more appropriate life support and water movement and everything. So aquarists by nature are very resourceful, and they will come up with a use for almost anything and everything you find in even the typical home. So using the to-go boxes from a local restaurant, yeah, that's just another resource for containment of larval or coral gametes.
Yeah, so Midori, who's the videographer for one of the coral care, part of the coral care team over there at the center, and took a lot of the videos Jim showed. She was explaining it to me that they learned through trial and error that type of container keeps the corals in the middle of the container as opposed to getting stuck on the edges. And I just thought that was really ingenious to figure that out. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat or any hands raised. So if you've had a question pop up, don't be shy about sharing it. I wanted to mention, Jim had mentioned, or maybe it was Beth, Worldwide Corals, which was a very helpful partner. We've had a number of different foundations and corporations step up to support the work. Some through our foundation, one of which Bass Pro Shops. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. And thank you to all the funders who helped get the center to this point. And as Jim mentioned, next up is expansion. So we're part of an effort to raise nearly $5 million for that expansion. And there's a lot of that came, a lot of our contributions came from individual donors. So if you're interested in donating to the Coral Center, we have an option on our website to donate to our Reef work, which majority of it goes to our center. If you want to, write in a memo line that you want that directed to the Coral Center, we're always happy to accommodate those requests. So I just wanted to share that.
And if I could just just interject one thing too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Worldwide Corals was an amazing gift. They provided an amazing gift that allowed us to get this thing jump started and starting quickly. Their generosity is also matched by some companies that have helped the greater project as well. And if we can give a shout out here, we have an initiative within the larger project called the Equipment Resource Initiative, and it really works towards giving back to our facilities, to our coral caregivers who have given so much, lessening the load, if you would, to making sure that we're creating a sustainable project here, that these facilities aren't carrying all of it. And we've got a number of those companies and that are working with us. We have Aqualogic, Piscine Energetics, Dynasty Marine. We've got Hayward Pumps, MRC Aquarium Systems. There are so many companies out there that have seen this challenge as something that they can help with. And while they can't hold corals themselves, they have helped us in so many other ways. So a shout out to all of them. And those folks are also listed on our website. So thanks,
Great.
Michelle, for allowing me to do that.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I don't want to keep people, if we're ready to wrap up, I'm going to drop a link to a survey in the chat. We'd love to get your feedback on what you thought went wrong. I'm going to apologize to the group. There was some technical issues with some malevolent actors, so I just appreciate your patience with that as we got those folks blocked and reported. If you ever see that happening and I'm not getting on it quick enough, please don't hesitate to send me a direct message and flag it for me. So just, thank you for your patience with that. But yeah, so, give us your feedback, like, hey, maybe Nazis aren't welcome in chats about corals. So that can be feedback you put in the survey, or anything else you'd like that you liked about this conversation, things you'd like to see for future conversations. Please don't hesitate to send us all that feedback. So I'm going to drop that survey link now. Beth and Jim, anything you guys want to make sure we say before we close up today?
Just a mutual thank you to you as well, you and Andy. Truly, without partners like the foundation, that this would be a very much harder weight to carry. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're super grateful to be part of this with AZA and SeaWorld and Disney and all our other partners. Jim, anything else you want to make sure we touch on before we sign off?
Just wanted to say thank you to everyone. It was a pleasure to speak with everybody and give everyone an update. The FCRC specifically is in a bit of an isolated location and an isolated operation, but it was awesome for us to share the work that we've done and the success we've seen, because it's due to everyone's efforts, the foundation, all the partners to make that happen. And I think for everyone associated with the foundation, you should be very proud of what's happening there, because it's been a very fast-paced and intense operation, and everything that had to come together at the right time with the right people. And quite frankly, the results speak for itself. So I think everyone should be very proud of that.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim. Again, really grateful for both of your and Beth's time today, and everybody for joining us. If you really want to just see those coral baby videos again, or want to share this conversation with any friends, we did record it, and so we'll be making that available on our social media and YouTube, the e-blast that you received to get this invite today. So feel free to share that with folks who might have missed this conversation, or if you just want to watch it over and over again. So we'll look forward to talking to everyone soon, and thank you again for joining us. Bye.